Hello, all. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to the Goddess Project podcast. If you are new to this podcast, thank you for joining me. Actually, if you're new to this podcast, just um, a note up front that we're going to be talking a lot about blood and bleeding and sacrifice. So that is in the title, but I'm not sure if you're prepared for all the ooey gooiness that we're going to talk about. If you've been listening to my podcast for a while and you're either listening on Spotify or Apple or wherever, or watching on YouTube, I want to say thank you. Hello, welcome back. I'm very excited to share with you this episode. My name is Dr. Carla Ionescu. I am an ancient historian. My PhD is in ancient Greece and Rome, particularly with focus on the goddess Artemis. And I wrote a book called She Who Hunts: How Artemis Changed the World. So if you're interested in Artemis, we're going to be talking about a couple of her bloody rites or bloody rites of passages today. But if you're interested in more about her and more about her worship, then please purchase my book anywhere where you buy books. And I also have a workshop, seminar, a 6 weeks workshop coming up through the Artemis Research Center, which is my learning center. And it's an episode. Hello, it's a workshop, 6 weeks workshop on embodying the goddess Artemis and learning about ancient traditions, ancient worship for her, but also what do we do about that? How do we practice what we're learning? And so if you're interested in that, please click on the buttons to uh, the Artemis Research Center, which are everywhere on my social media and on YouTube. And feel free to sign up to the newsletter and sign up to anything you like and follow along and subscribe. And I hope to see you all in some of those courses and some of those projects. For today, and I should say, for those of you that are new to the podcast, this is an unedited episode, an unedited podcast, which means that I am just here talking to you, and I am going to go over all of the some of the, or many of the bleeding sacrifices for the gods, for the ancient gods, but it is unedited. I literally post it just as it is recorded because I kind of sometimes, as some of you who have been with me for a while, thoughts occur to me while we're talking. And I also want it to seem like we're having a real conversation. I know it's not a two-way conversation, um, but I want it to feel more like a conversation rather than a lecture. And so it is totally unedited. And it is pretty much the way I like talking to my students at the university where I teach. Today, we're going to be covering bloody sacrifices. And so I've had to sort of narrow it down so that we're not here for 3 months because there's so much blood sacrifices and blood offerings and blood meaning. But I did want to sort of touch upon several things in this episode. So we're going to look at things like menstrual blood. Prepare yourself, just giving you a heads up. We are going to look at animal sacrifice and human sacrifice in ancient Greece, mostly, although there will be other examples as well. We are going to look at the sacrifice of children. And I don't mean that, like, please don't worry, it's not traumatic in any way, but the stories of gods demanding child sacrifice, like Iphigenia or Abraham and Isaac, or things like that, or the Minotaur, even though the Minotaur is technically not a god, but the sacrifice of youths. So this is what I mean. We're going to be looking at that concept. And then we are going to be talking about the new Gen V TV show. And if you haven't watched it, that's okay. I'm only going to be talking about the first episode. And blood bending in the Avatar. So if you're an Avatar, and the Avatar, the animated series, sorry, not the blue people, and blood bending. So we're going to kind of end with blood, blood control, blood manipulation in popular culture. And so we're going to kind of wrap it up with that. So I'm really, really excited to talk to you about all of these things. Let's begin with the blood is the life. Now, I don't know. I say this all the time, and I don't know if people know this is a Dracula quote. And I think it's from the Dracula with Keanu Reeves, but don't quote me, where I think Dracula goes, the blood is the life, like that, you know? And I don't know if some of you know this, but for many, many years, I taught a vampire course through Seneca College. And I'd probably still be teaching it today. It's just that vampires have kind of fallen out of favor. So it came up with Twilight and that whole kind of trend. And also because I'm Romanian and have a Transylvanian background. And of course, Dracula comes out of Transylvania. But I have been fascinated with the symbolism of blood, the multiplexities, I don't know if that's a word, of blood ritual. In my course, I used to teach about people using, like Elizabeth Bathory, who used blood to rejuvenate their, I don't know, their youth, their faces, their bodies, and they would either put it on themselves or drink it. So we're going to talk about some of that today. And I mean, I think we've all seen the Kardashians do that, what is it called? The vampiric facial. So like the bleeding facials or putting blood on your face. Although I wonder what you'll think today, actually, because today we're going to talk about menstrual blood for a little bit. And one of the secrets to aging or anti-aging was using menstrual blood for your face and your body. And so I wonder if the Kardashians have it wrong in the sense that they are using, I don't know how to call bodily, they're all bodily blood, but like vein blood rather than womb blood for their face. Perhaps there should be, someone should tell them about menstrual blood. Yeah. But this is probably not new to all of you. And I think all of you that have joined me have heard of some kind of connection with blood and life and blood and rejuvenation and blood and all these things. So I do want to cover some of them. And I want to tell you a little bit about what did the ancients do with blood, whether it's sacrificial blood or menstrual blood or all the other blood. So let's begin with the ancient Greeks, since they are my area of expertise. So in ancient Greeks, women's bleeding or women's menstrual bleeding was considered a cosmic event. So it usually was tied to the moon or to the lunar cycle. And for those of you who might not know, the word menstruation is etymologically related to the moon. Yeah. It comes from this idea of menses, which are derived from the Latin mensis or month, which in turn relates to the Greek mene or moon. And this is because, as some of you know, that ancient women's cycles were tied to the moon. So women used to bleed on the full moon, or the moon cycle is every 28 days. So they would tend to bleed at the same time. And I think we've talked about, when we talked about the Holy Grail, and we talked a lot about blood then, we talked a little bit about this idea that women synchronized their menstrual cycles and that their menstrual cycles could be weaponized, or their menstrual blood could be weaponized. Okay. And so there are many traditions, not just in ancient Greece, but for example, even in the ancient Egyptians, that involve the digestion of blood, or the ingestion of menstrual blood. And it is because this blood was thought to be magic. Women were thought to be at the peak of their power, spiritual power, even physical power. And so they were thought, and mental power at this time. So it's a very, it's a magic time to work with spells or to work with manifestations, to work with any of that stuff. And so, in fact, ancient Egyptians used to ingest menstrual blood mixed with red wine to increase spiritual power. Okay. And in lots of ancient Greeks festivals, especially in the spring, menstrual blood was spread across the earth. For example, it was sometimes mixed with corn, and it was thought to increase fertility. Okay. The physician Hippocrates started bleeding sick people. Okay. Oh, this is a theory. He may have started bleeding sick people because he saw that women would recover from bloating and aches and pains after starting their periods. I mean, this is a great observation because for those of us who have bled, I mean, you don't have to have bled. You can have anyone, you can know people who bleed monthly, who have their menstrual cycles. But those of us who have them or experience them know that there is of that bloating period, that swelling, that pain period, right? Everything hurts, blah, blah, blah. And then once you have your period or at the end of your period, you feel better. So I think that's a great observation. And I don't blame Hippocrates at all. But there's this theory that he may have started bloodletting because he saw this relief from women's menstrual cycle. There were, of course, the Greeks were, as we know, patriarchal in nature. And so, for example, Aristotle, who hated women, Aristotle disliked women so much. He saw them as unfinished men, right? And he has that famous quote where he says, we have sex with men for pleasure and women for procreation. I mean, Aristotle was a real piece of work. But he saw menstrual blood as a lesser form of semen, which of course is ridiculous. But Aristotle has some of his own issues. So in the ancient world, just like much of today and for many, many years, young women started bleeding or started their menarche around the age of 14, 10, 12, 14. And the goddess Artemis, as we'll talk about, is a goddess that was in charge of the rites of passage for young girls, either right pre-menarche or as they had their menarche, depends on where we're talking about, and as they entered into marriageable age. I was talking to my students yesterday, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, ironically, I was talking to them about blood yesterday too in my class, but I was talking to them about this idea that bleeding and the womb, we were talking about womb culture and the womb. Bleeding and the womb is the only reason, or bleeding or menarche is the only reason we're all here, in the sense that a woman has to bleed in order to be able to give birth. And so I was explaining to them that if your mother didn't bleed, you wouldn't be here. And if her mother didn't bleed, she wouldn't be here. And so on, all the way back to the conception of humankind. And so I know that we have lots of these monotheistic, Judeo-Christian ideas that a sky god creates humans out of his thoughts. He has these thoughts and they come to life. But the truth is that every human born on this planet is born because of a bleeding woman, right? And at some point in the beginning of time, or in the beginning of evolution, wherever you want to think about it, the first woman that bled was able to give birth to the rest of us. And so often women's menarche has been, for many, 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 like hundreds of thousands of years, this period was a time of celebration. It was a time of power. Menstrual blood was sometimes used in pharmacology, in ancient pharmacology, to produce, healing effects, produce any kind of pain relief effect, all that kind of stuff. Mostly for women. Now, we don't have too much evidence in Greece that they were using this blood for as a remedy for men. However, as we'll see, there are numerous examples in which this blood was used as a spell, as a tool for a spell, or as a medium for in developing more power, increasing power, magic spells, like people would put it in their foods, things like that. Yeah. Now, if we're talking about the Judeo-Christian, or the pre-Judeo or pre-Jewish or pre-Hebrew text, or early Hebrew culture, I don't know how many of you have read the book The Red Tent by Anita Diamond, who talks, or it's historical fiction, but she talks about the separation of men and women during their menstrual cycle. And so women go into a red tent, literally red for blood, and they spend their 5 to 7 days while they're menstruating there. But this red tent was thought to be powerful in the sense that no one came near it. Only women, so younger and older women, would come in and out, while the menstruating women would stay in it. Before a concept like the red tent, there are stories of sort of early peoples, let's say early Neolithic people, or perhaps even pre that, where menstrual blood was used on weapons to create more power. People would paint their bodies with it. Often, like I said before, people would use it on their faces. I read this story, but I can't remember exactly where I found it now. I think it's an ancient papyrus scroll that suggested, and I think it was out of Rome, maybe, that suggested that if women, for example, if a woman had like droopy body parts, or for example, droopy breasts, or a swollen stomach, that they could put menstrual blood on these areas, and that menstrual blood would perk things up. And so, even for example, as far as Rome, Pliny, the author Pliny, talks about that even though menstrual blood is baneful, right? Like, oh my God, it's so baneful. It has potentially useful implications. And one of the things that he talks about is, of course, its use in spells. Elizabeth Bathory used blood. She was a countess in Eastern Europe in the 14th century, 14th, 15th century. And she used blood to coat her body, the blood of young virgins, to coat her body with. Now, it is unclear whether she used menstrual blood. It is more likely that she used, I'm going to call it vein blood, because by the time we get to the 14th century, menstrual blood goes through several revisions in which it becomes dirty, impure, something to not be celebrated, something to be hidden, and something to be thrown away. So if you think about it, in the ancient world, people used to collect it and use it for whatever, let's say, magic or healing or anti-aging, let's say. And then over, the last 2000 years, it became something that was hidden, and it became associated with a curse. So is this idea, and even today, people will say, oh, I've got my monthly curse. And again, that has a lot to do with Christianity and the sin of Eve. And apparently, because when Adam and Eve found out that they were naked after they ate the apple, suddenly Eve was then given pregnancy or procreation. And suddenly, because Yahweh had punished them, this seemed like her bleeding seemed like a curse. I mean, the whole story is so complicated and so fantastical in a way, because here is a God that creates with thoughts, or creates a woman out of a man's body totally unnaturally, totally unnaturally, and then punishes a woman, Eve, with the curse of bleeding and the curse of procreation. All of that is, of course, political propaganda and patriarchal propaganda. But this is the beginning of seeing menstrual blood as something other than magical, other than powerful. There are some scholars that tell us that actually the Greeks, for example, predating the Christians, didn't see any difference between bleeding, vein bleeding, and menstrual blood. But again, there are different opinions on this. And of course, there are different scholars that write this. You can imagine that menstrual blood was often thought of as magical because women bleed for 7 days, let's say up to 7 days, and don't die. And if you cut your arm in war, or your leg or whatever, and bleed for 7 days, you will die. And so this should still be magical today, right? Like, I know that we can scientifically explain it, which is great, but it is still magic that a human can bleed, and every month, once a month, and they survive. And not only that, but the bleeding that they do not only does not kill them, but it is the source of creation. It is the source of life. Yeah. Pliny, coming back to Pliny for a minute, I found a reference where he writes that if a woman got her period during a solar or lunar eclipse, since we are in eclipse season, she could kill a man just by having sex with him. So those of you who are bleeding out there once a month, this month we have 2 eclipses. We just had a solar one and we're going to have a lunar one. So if you're bleeding during any of that time, ladies and gentlemen, be careful of how much sex you have, just in case. Yeah. This idea of Pliny's that a woman could kill a man while having sex with him during her menstruation seems to almost bleed. Oh, that was not an intended pun, but bleed into this idea that the period blood had the power to damage male genitals. Yeah. But again, the Romans, we're told, also had very similar practices with menstrual blood. So during fertility rites, women who were bleeding would hike up their skirts and run across the field or walk across crops. And not only was that thought to fertilize the earth, but also it was thought to kill pests like crickets or locusts. So imagine this phenomenon. So, for example, this phenomenon is witnessed in Cappadocia, in Italy, during a particularly bad beetle infestation. Okay. A bunch of menstruating women walk through the fields with their skirts hiked up to their butt cheeks, and those beetles fell dead right off the corn. Okay. And so this blood was so powerful that it had the power to kill off plagues. Yeah. So it's a double-edged sword. Yeah. Because in some ways, it's so powerful that it's healing and it's protecting and it's fertilizing. In another way, it's so powerful that those who do not bleed, particularly the male sex, are afraid of that level of power. Yeah? And so some use it like on their weapons or their shields or whatever, depends on who we're talking about, and some fear it. So you can see that there is and especially some men fear it because they also believe that women could use it to put in their food or in their drinks, like we saw with the Egyptians, and manipulate them with it. Yeah. So when I was a kid, I used to hear these stories that men who fell in love with women that, let's say, the community or the friends couldn't explain, why is he so attracted to this woman? There used to be this idea, I don't know if this is still around, you guys will have to tell me, that somehow she may be putting her menstrual blood in his food as a spell. So it's funny because it could be weaponized. Menstrual blood is weaponized, but somehow it works. It can work against women as well. And so very, very interesting. Menstrual blood has lots of power, and is a very, very powerful form of blood. So I'm hoping that you see that. So the blood is the life. In this case, not in the vampiric sense that Dracula meant, which is, sort of drinking it from the vein, but the blood, the true blood that is the life, the true source of life is menstrual blood. An undeniable fact. Yeah. So let's move into some bleeding for the gods and bleeding in ancient Greece. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories from Pausanias. Number one, because some of you know how much I really enjoy Pausanias and how much I'd love to walk in his footsteps one day soon. But number two, because he tells some great stories. So I'm going to tell you about Sparta, and I'm going to tell you about a couple of bleeding rites of passage for Artemis as well. If you've ever go to Sparta, one of the things that maybe is not on the visiting list, sometimes I just think about all the ways I want to take people on tours to these sites. Yeah, like I just feel this calling to take all of you with me to these sites and these places. I just need to find a little team or a couple of other people that are willing to do like the organization work. Because as a professor at the university, I teach as a contract professor. I teach a lot of courses during the year, and I just don't have enough time to do the planning. But one day, my friends, we will go and see all these sites. This picture that I'm showing you here, if you're watching on YouTube or even if you're listening on Spotify, I will describe it for you. So this is the ruins on the right-hand side here, the ruins of the Temple of Artemis or Thea at Sparta. And it is a place that is not very visited. When I went there, I had so much trouble finding it because you go, there's a theater, there's a couple of other temples out just outside of the modern day city of Sparta. And then finding this site takes a little figuring out. Anyways, there's not much to see here. As you can imagine, there are just bottom remains of buildings and the temple site. But it is a really lovely small sanctuary or temple, and it has a really bloody heritage or a really bloody ritual that the Spartans used to do. And I don't know, I don't know why no one has made a film about this. I mean, this would be a wonderful moment in some kind of Spartan film, because we have 5,000 Spartan films, to focus on the practices in Sparta. So I will tell you a little bit from Pausanias, who traveled there. So maybe I did travel a little bit in his footsteps, because I knew there was a temple of Orthia in Sparta. And I guess the first time I must have stumbled on it was in reading his travel writings. So he says in the place called Limenoin, this is in Lacedaemon, sorry, my pronunciation today is a bit off. There is a sacred grove to Artemis or Thea. And this was a wooden image. Artemis or Thea is said to have been a wooden image, which Orestes and Iphigenia stole out of the Tauric land and brought it down to this space. So the Spartans also worshipped Artemis or Thea. And the Spartan Limnations and the people of Messoa and Pitani and all these people, while sacrificing to Artemis, fell into a quarreling. So they were arguing, which led also to bloodshed. Many were killed at the altar, and the rest died of disease. Whereat an oracle was delivered to them. So after this happened, there was an oracle that was delivered to them that they should stain the altar with human blood. Okay. So let me rephrase that. So fighting over this cult statue of Artemis or Thea took place between the Spartans and a few other neighboring communities. And because they fought and a bunch of them died and a bunch of them injured themselves, there was an oracle that said, in order for you to now make up for this offense to the goddess Artemis or Thea, you must now start to cover the altar in human blood. Now, there's lots of stories about covering the altar in animal blood, which we're going to get to in a minute, but this required human blood sacrifice. And so there are some scholars who say that for a while, Spartans offered human sacrifice. One warrior, one young male would sacrifice himself or be sacrificed for Artemis or Thea. However, after time, and by the time we get to Lycurgus, he decided to change this, so human sacrifice fell out of favor, let's just say, okay? There's a lot of writing about human sacrifice, but after a while, people were like, okay, it's not okay, too much human sacrifice. And so what they did is they began a scourging or a whipping of young men, okay? And so there's several practices. One is where a priestess stands by the altar holding the wooden image of Artemis or Thea, okay? It's small and it's light, okay? And the scourgers, the young men, are whipping themselves into a frenzy so that they can bleed all over the altar together. So it doesn't require one human sacrifice. There's all of these young men bleeding together on the altar. And you can imagine that the priestess is full of blood, the cult statue is full of blood, the altar is full of blood. So sometimes they would whip themselves in such a frenzy that it's sort of like a last man standing. They would see who would stand. Sometimes there are rumors that young men would die during this ritual. And this ritual would only stop when the statue, the wooden statue would become so full of blood, so like wet wood, imagine this, okay, that it would be too heavy for the priestess to carry, okay? And so she would then say, okay, that is enough. The goddess has been fed. Yeah. There's also a couple of other stories of the Spartans. There's one about that the Romans carried on later on. There's one about stealing cheese that I really like. So they would put cheese on the altar and they would ask young men as a rite of passage, for example, to come up and try and steal the cheese. So they would have kind of two teams, or they would have guardians standing by with whips, and young men would come and try and steal the cheese. And as they came, they would get whipped and whipped and whipped and whipped. And they would run back and then come back and steal the cheese, run back and come back. And so sometimes they did a competition in two teams where they whipped each other and saw how much cheese they could steal. And sometimes they did it in a competition where the man or the young man who stole the most cheese would be sort of the winner, but also would probably have bled, have bled a lot on that altar. And so there's this tradition that even though the human sacrifice fell out of favor, Artemis or Thea still demanded human blood. And so human blood becomes very, very important. So one of the things that I argue in my book is how bloodthirsty Artemis really is. And there are several examples in her rituals in which she demands sacrifice, either human sacrifice or blood sacrifice, or sometimes she punishes humans with bleeding and dying, or sometimes she withholds blood. So blood and the ancient gods and power over blood is particularly important. And Artemis's power over blood is fascinating to me because, as we'll see, there's a very fantastic connection to blood bending. Yeah. There is this example that I hadn't planned on talking about, but I will talk about it now because it feels like such a great connection. There is a story about Artemis Apankomene, which translates to Artemis strangled. And there's this long story that there were a couple of children in one of the villages who were playing with the statue of Artemis or around the statue of Artemis, and they somehow wrapped this rope around her and kind of strangled the statue, etc. And that the villagers saw this as an offense and killed the children and offered them a sacrifice to Artemis. But this backfired on them because Artemis became so upset with the loss of the children. As we know, part of her responsibility or part of her care is children, that she stopped all the menstruation of the women in the town. And so no one could have, could have children or could have their periods. And then there's stories that she may have actually forced women to miscarry. And so there's this seen as this plague where no children could be born and no bleeding was done. I bring that up because I would like to state that Artemis is the very first blood bender. Yeah. She is able to withhold menstrual blood in women, and therefore she is able to withhold life. And there's lots of stories that are connected with this story about the way that Artemis is also associated with the tree from which some of the ropes were made in the ancient world. And so this idea of making rope, this idea of roping the womb like a girdle, of tightening the rope to stop bleeding. And as some of you know, when you have, for example, an artery bleed, the first thing that you do is you tighten some type of rope or band around it so it stops bleeding. So this power of Artemis to stop bleeding is unique to her. And I would argue that she's one of the first bloodbenders. In fact, I should probably totally coin that, Artemis, the first bloodbender, and talk about some of her blood rites. I will tell you one other whipping story, a story that comes from Philostratus, 1st, 2nd century CE. And he talks about, he writes this story in the life of Apollonius. And so I'll read you a little bit of the story. The Egyptian sage Thespison put some questions to Apollonius. Okay. who was a pagan prophet in the 1st century CE, about the scourging in Sparta. And he asked if the Laconians were smitten with rods in public. That is, were the Laconians beaten bloody with rods? And Apollonius says yes. Okay. As men can spite them, so men used to hit each other with rods. It was especially men of noble and distinguished birth among them that were so treated. Okay. The custom of whipping or hitting is a ceremony in honor of Artemis Scythia, or so they say, and was prescribed by the oracles. To oppose the regulations of the gods, in my opinion, was utter madness. So that means to deny her this blood would have been outer madness. And so here too, you have the sprinkling of the goddess's altar with human blood. In this case, it is with a rod, so hitting with a rod. Okay, the scythoi held the altar to be worthy of human blood. Okay, but the Lacedaemonians, why can I not say any Greek words today? I'm so sorry. The Lacedaemonians modified the ceremony from human sacrifice into another contest of endurance. And in this case, they offered their blood as a fruit of their labor. Okay. And in this particular play by Philostratus, the character says, why then do they not sacrifice strangers or people from other villages to Artemis? Okay, as it was their right to do. And Apollonius replies in this piece, because he says, it is not congenial to any of the Greeks to adopt in their full rigor the manners and customs of barbarians. And so this has been interpreted both as outsiders. So the idea that Greeks would not want to adopt the system of sacrificing an outsider for their own goddess as barbarians or outsiders do. But there's also this idea that the Greek blood, just like the Spartan blood, whatever, the Greek, whoever associated themselves as Greek, was more sacred to the gods than the blood of outsiders. And so often you see a lot of self-flagellance, self-whipping, self-scourging. And there are stories that tell us that the Spartans were very proud of their whipping scars because it showed that they had survived this offer to the goddess Artemis. So let's talk about bleeding sacrifice. I want to talk a little bit about bleeding animal sacrifices, and then we'll talk a little bit about other human sacrifices. And so let's talk a little bit about what it was like to have in the Greek world. What does the festival of sacrifice look like? So I'm just going to pick one from Athens that we can kind of go through the steps, okay? In a regular or in a pan-Hellenic or a pan-Atheniac festival, there are a few steps that were used, standard steps in animal sacrifice. So the ceremony always starts with a procession that is led by basket carriers, and they were usually well-born women or young women. They carry a sacrificial basket to the altar. They're accompanied by musicians, lots of members of every part of society. So officials, soldiers, other community members, everybody's in the profession. Then they get to the altar. The altar is always outside of the temple. So when you go visit ancient temple sites, you will see that there is, in the case of Artemis, but other gods, there is a small temple site, like a small building would have been the temple. And then outside, usually in front of it, is I can't think of an altar that is still standing today, but there will have been like a square on the floor where the ancient altar would have stood. So everyone would be able to view this ritual, and everyone would be able to view the sacrificing. So they get to the altar, okay, and then there's a water basin. They have fire usually. They have a water basin. They have a knife. And a sacrificial knife only used for sacrifice. And we are told that they walk clockwise around the altar. Okay. Then the officiant, or depends on the nature of the sacrifice, the head of the family, the community leader, the priestess, the religious official, wash their hands in the sacred water or the water basin. The animal is then adorned. So there's lots of depictions of animals adorned with flowers, usually flowers, or painted symbols on them, or the animal is made very, very beautiful and is then sprinkled with water. Okay. Then there is a ritual silence. So like a moment of silence. Then there is prayer. Barley and grain is then scattered. Again, fertility, symbols of fertility, symbols of growth. And the first offering is the hairs cut from the forehead of the animal, which are then thrown into the fire. So the fire is set up by the altar or on the altar sometimes, but usually by the altar, beside the altar. The throat, the throat of the animal is then slit. Sometimes this is accompanied by females crying, screaming, crying. Sometimes this is done in silence, depends again which community we're talking about. And the blood from the throat of the animal is collected in a special bowl. The animal is then sliced into portions. Some are burned for the god, some are given to special members who participated, like the priestess, and the leftovers are given to the participants, or they are left for the temple to sell. Okay. And so these are sort of standard steps that we're going. There are different aspects of it. So for example, how much was sacrificed makes a big, big difference. Yeah. How large? So is it a bull? Is it a calf? Is it a goat? So everything had meaning, right? So young, like baby animals had a certain meaning in being sacrificed. Large, beautiful bulls had certain meaning in being sacrificed. Goats as well. It is very clear, it is made very clear that the sacrifice is not a hunt. It is often also made clear that the animal is willing, although that's a trick. So there's a lot there, when you read primary text, you see some of this description that the animal is calm, that the animal is willing. Sometimes there are scholars who talk about the animal may have been given a drought to make them, of course, less rebellious. Usually the sacrificial, those who know how to do the sacrificial cutting can do it very quickly so the animal does not suffer. In fact, actually, one of the key to this ritual sacrifice is to make sure that the animal does not suffer. And so, like, you don't want the animal crying out. You don't want the animal fighting. There is something about a willing sacrifice that the ancient found particularly beautiful and made it that much of a better offering to the gods. Yeah. And so things like sheep and pigs were often sacrificed more than cattle, for example, because they were more expensive. Cattle was more expensive. In the Iliad, though, we are told that no expense was spared, as the animals often function as a wealth or a symbol of status for those who are sacrificing. So Agamemnon, for example, sacrifices 100 cattle or ox to Apollo to purify his army, which, if you think about a military army who has that many ox or cattle, that is for food, right? That is to maintain the army. But all of these cattle, 100 cattle or oxen, are sacrificed to Apollo to purify his army. In Artemis, for example, in Artemis Agraterra, we are told that on the 6th of Thargalion, which brought lots of good fortune to Athens and many other cities, when the Persians were defeated in 490 BCE, the Athenians sacrificed to the goddess Agraterra or Artemis 300 goats. And so on that day, for example, when the Persians were defeated in 490 BCE, there were, in order to thank the goddess for such victory, 300 goats were sacrificed. So goats, cattle, etc., and the amount of sacrifice is equal to a person's status. Or perhaps if an individual has something that they're really, I don't know, let's say they want to sacrifice for the health of their children or the health of their parents or whatever. So the higher the sacrifice, the better the animal, the purer or the more expensive, clearly that is a better sacrifice. But let's also talk a little bit about Greeks and human sacrifice, right? We've talked about the Spartans and others, whipping themselves and bleeding, but we do have some stories of actual human sacrifice in the Odyssey. Of course, the Odyssey does contain a number of myths about human sacrifices, but we do have some stories of outside of Homer as well of human sacrifices. So Iphigenia is one of the most famous, but I would like to talk about her next and compare her to Isaac. So we're going to skip her. But Polyxena, who is sacrificed here in this image, if you're watching with me on YouTube, which has a bunch of Greek soldiers holding Polyxena and also cutting the throat like a sacrificial animal. So the sacrifice has the same symbolism. Polyxena was the daughter of Priam, who was the king of Troy. And Homer writes that she was claimed by the ghost of Achilles as his share of the spoils and was therefore put to death at his tomb. But many agree that Achilles' ghost appeared before the Greeks, saying that to have favorable winds on the way back to Greece after the war, they needed to sacrifice Polyxena at the foot of his grave. Hecuba, devastatingly, of course, is pleading not to lose another child, but Polyxena said that she would prefer to die as a sacrifice for Achilles rather than become a slave to the Greeks. Yeah. And Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, was the one who slit Polyxena's throat. So again, another devastating example of human sacrifice, in this case of female sacrifice for a man, by a man, etc. Yeah, I was going to go on a rant here, but let me just tell you the second one. I have a little rant about bleeding and sacrifice of humans, but I will save it. Another story tells us about Idomeneus, who led the Cretan armies to the Trojan War. In the Iliad, he is found among the first rank of the Greek generals, one of Agamemnon's most trusted advisors. However, a later tradition of Apollodorus in Athens says that after the war, Idomeneus' ship hit a terrible storm. And as a result, he promised Poseidon that he would sacrifice the first living thing he saw when he returned home if Poseidon would save his ship and crew. Devastatingly, the first living thing that Idomeneus saw when he arrived home was his son. And Idomeneus sacrificed his son. Yeah. And so, because this is written later, Apollodorus writes later, we are told that the gods were angry at the murder of his own son and sent a plague to Crete. And his subjects, the Cretans, sent him in exile to Calabria and then to Colophon in Asia Minor, where he died. So a lot of these mythologies around human sacrifice or stories around human sacrifice are based on perhaps more ancient stories. But by the time they make it, let's say, into a little more modern text, human sacrifice is looked down upon, especially of a son, which is interesting because Polyxena's story is not changed. She remains sacrificed for the ghost of Achilles. But we can see that for Idomeneus, for example, sacrificing his own son is seen as something that is worth exile, and he is sent away. Outside of Homer's work, we know of the sacrifices to the Minotaur, where there are 14 14 youths that are sacrificed, a human sacrifice, so 7 girls and 7 boys, and they are sent unarmed into the labyrinth to be the food for the Minotaur. And so again, we have the sacrifice of young people, or the sacrifice of youths teenagers. Yeah. There's also been a study a discovery several years ago now, maybe almost 10 years ago, on Mount Lycaon, which is the mountain of Zeus, where they have actually found human remains. Yeah. A young boy, for example, they found the human remains of a young boy who seems to have been sacrificed with other animals. So they found this young boy's remains with animal remains. And scholars, archaeologists, for example, the archaeologist on this dig is Dr. David Gilman Romano. He's a Greek archaeologist from University of Arizona. He says that there are several ancient sources that mention, or rumors, that human sacrifice took place at the altar of Zeus here in Lycaon. However, they are hesitant to say whether or not this young man was a human sacrifice. But this is the first human bones that are found at a sacrificial site, at a sacrificial altar. Yeah. So he's like, Dr. Romano says, this is not a cemetery. It is not a place that you would bury someone. So the odds that this was a human sacrifice for Zeus are very, very good. And the key to it is that the skull is missing. Yeah. And so this was a decapitation of some point, perhaps, unless the skull somehow went missing in some animal or some other way. But it does seem that a young boy's body, alongside sacrificial animal bodies or bones, seems like there may have been human sacrifices to Zeus late into the classical period. One of the things that we don't get to talk about, and that perhaps if you're interested, maybe I could do an episode on, is the sacrifice of young men or consorts to the gods. And there are many, many stories around, especially around Minoans and especially around Crete, and many others, where every 6 or 7 years, the consort to the priestess was sacrificed. And there are many stories in which young men are sacrificed, are seen to sort of embody the dying god Dionysus, or a dying fertility god. This is where the story of Jesus comes out and things like that, or is inspired by for later. So there are traditions in which young men embody the dying god and are killed, said to be resurrected on the other side, obviously not humanly resurrected. And there are lots of stories of that kind of sacrifice, although I do have to say that again is a type of self-sacrifice. That is, the young men appear to go willingly. In the case of Minoan Crete, the men, sometimes they're not young, they could be in their 20s, mid-20s, depends how the time falls in their age, are prepared and go very willingly, spend the 6-7 years in rotation, preparing for this sacrifice, for this. So I think that's a really fascinating topic, although it requires a bit more research, because the data that we have is still several stories, let's say, and you can't really build an entire custom. Well, what I mean is you can't build a general custom or a common custom from a few stories, but it would be interesting to research this. And I'm sure there's lots of work out there on this idea that male consorts were often seen to embody this dying god, especially every spring and or winter to spring, before the spring solstice, and they would sacrifice themselves in order for the community to thrive, and for the fertility of the grains and the people. Yeah, so that would be an interesting, I think, addition, although that's less bloody. But actually, that takes me right into this idea that gods demand a blood price. And so talking about Iphigenia and talking about Isaac. So I wanted to compare these two things. So although the sacrifices are one of a daughter and one of a son, I see the sacrifices of being almost identical. And there are other examples of this. So this is not the only example, but I do want to compare these two examples of a father being asked by a god or their god to sacrifice their child to prove or to make up for an offense. So let's just talk briefly about the two. So in the case of Iphigenia, Agamemnon, we are told, offends Artemis by either shooting one of her deer or boasting that he can shoot better than her. Whatever he does, he pisses her off. And she turns around and says, for the offense that you have done, you will have to sacrifice your youngest child, which is Iphigenia, who is about 12, 13. Interestingly, just coming of age, just possibly coming into hermenage, just possibly coming into marriageable age. And we are told that Agamemnon, or you will not get any wind in your sails and you will not be able to head over to Troy. This is before the Trojan War begins, or on the way to the Trojan War. And we know that Agamemnon tells his wife, Clytemnestra, that he wants to marry Iphigenia to Achilles so that she should send her daughter to the front of the battlefield and they will do the wedding there, which already is a bit suspect because who needs to get married during a battle? But either way, Clytemnestra says, okay. Iphigenia shows up at the front of the battlefield, probably shocked to see her father preparing an altar. But actually, no, maybe not shocked. Maybe she thought that, the ritual sacrifice would be for the wedding. But we are told that Agamemnon lays Iphigenia on the Altizer, right, like an offering, and places her on the altar, is about to, has a knife in his hand and is about to kill her. And we are told two stories. We are told that at the very last minute, right before Agamemnon stabs or kills his daughter in sacrifice for Artemis, Artemis flies down and replaces Iphigenia with a fawn or a baby deer. Okay. And so as the knife is coming down, instead of Iphigenia, a fawn dies. And Artemis takes Iphigenia with her and gives her a priestess role or leading role. Iphigenia remains forever with Artemis, and there's a long tradition of Iphigenia being a priestess for Artemis at Beron, at Tauropolis, and many other areas. And so they become almost, I don't know if I would say mother-daughter. I would say more like mentor and mentee, older sister, younger sister. They have this very close relationship. There's a very Iphigenia is very, very close to Artemis and is one of her leading priestesses. So there's this idea that the gods demand a sacrifice, that the sacrifice be a child sacrifice, right? Then we have the case of Abraham and Isaac. Now, I thought of this. I was sitting in one of my world religions classes. One of my colleagues was talking about Judaism, and so he started talking about the story of Abraham. We started at the beginning. And as he's talking about the story of Abraham, I can literally see Agamemnon and Iphigenia, and I see so many parallels, and I'm thinking, oh my God, all of these gods demand the sacrifice of children. Because I suppose, logically, that is the highest type of sacrifice that a parent can do. Although we saw Idomeneus being punished for that later on by his community. However, the god, like in that case, Poseidon, didn't seem too offended about the sacrifice of a son. So we have Abraham, who also has created this covenant with Yahweh, and they're in a new relationship. It is true that Abraham does not offend Yahweh, but in fact, Yahweh gifts Abraham at an old age with a son. And then Yahweh asks Abraham to sacrifice the son to prove his faith. Okay? So again, we have a God who is demanding the child sacrifice. And so Abraham takes Isaac up on the mountain, he lays him on this rock, and he's about to stab him. I mean, I can only imagine the terror of these children, right? And he's about to stab his son through Sarah. Sorry, not only son, because he has another. And he's about to stab him, and an angel of the Lord appears and says, no, 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 God is just testing you. We will replace Isaac with a lamb. Yeah. And so again, sort of a young animal is replacing the child or human sacrifice. And of course, the Abraham sacrifices the lamb and all as well. And then Isaac becomes, enters into that connection or enters into that relationship with Yahweh and continues, the line of Abraham and becomes a leader in Hebrew stories. And so, and in the Hebrew community. And so the parallels between these two fascinate me for two reasons. Number one, because these are both fathers. And I have yet to tell you a story in which a mother sacrifices her own child by killing them. And that is not to say that women do not kill their children. I don't want to say that. I mean, that's a huge statement. But I do want you to notice that there is this commonality. Even Idomeneus is also a father who is, who sacrifices a son. And that there is something about let's see how I can take it. So there's this sort of there's a cycle that happens. So a young woman who bleeds creates life. Men don't bleed menarche. They don't have menstrual blood. And they do not create life in that way. They do not carry the life. They do not have the blood of the life, right? So they are somehow removed from that connection. And by that connection, I mean not a biological connection, a magical connection between creating life through bleeding. But what happens that's really fascinating is that the fathers of these children are willing to take that, to bleed the children, to take that life, to put out that life. Yeah, I don't know if you're seeing that in the same way that I'm seeing it, but I'm finding it fascinating. And while I think that fathers are fundamental to raising children, and I think that there are so many incredible fathers. I have an incredible father myself, and I was very, very privileged for that. There seems to be this trend that fathers are willing to bleed their children for the gods, or for war, or in Abraham's case, for community and for descendants and for their gods, right? So that somehow fathers place a higher value to either their connection to the divine, their own connection to the divine, or war, battle, whatever, right? So that the children become tools, that the children become, valuable tools. And so I thought that was really, really interesting as a commentary on how sacrifice works, who is willing to sacrifice, and and what is a true sacrifice. Yeah. I did want to take you through the blood of sort of the Eucharist and drinking blood, but I think that we've talked a bit about this concept that ingesting blood gives you power in the Holy Grail. And if you're interested in the way that Christians tap into ancient rituals of blood drinking, you can, if you look at the Holy Grail episode, it goes into detail. But there is, again, this connection with the Eucharist, which is the blood and body of Christ, and this connection of bleeding, of ingesting the blood of the sacred. And I was looking for gods who bleed, trying to see if there was any gods that bled as a sacrifice. Yeah. And they're harder to come by. I mean, so what I'm saying is that Jesus seems to be one of the few divinities that bleeds as a sacrifice. Ironically, or perhaps not ironically, Jesus is also the son of a god, and his father sacrifices him for the good of humanity. Yeah. And if we tap into the fact that the God as father of Jesus is Yahweh of Abraham, what we see here is that Yahweh had asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham was willing to do so. And then God saves Isaac. And then, when Jesus comes, according to Christians, there's a long story there, but according to Christians, Yahweh sacrifices his own human son, bleeds that son for the salvation of humanity. And so isn't that amazing that there's something very masculine here, I have to say. There's something very masculine here, because there's something about bleeding here. And I read this comment a couple of days ago on an Instagram post that was talking about war and men going to war and men bleeding. And someone had commented something like, women naturally bleed, and so they don't have to bleed others, or something like that. And I thought, wow. And men bleed themselves and bleed others and bleed their families, in this case, their sons or daughters, in order to feel connected or offer sacrifice to the divine. Where women, because we naturally bleed, that is a natural connection to the divine. And I thought, I'm expanding on this comment, but I thought this was a really interesting concept, and it really had me thinking, right? This is why I kind of wanted to do this episode, because it had me thinking about bleeding and the fact that because women bleed, we are not blood hungry or bloodthirsty, but because we bleed, we also create. Now I'm speaking for biological women as myself, as far as bleeding. But because we bleed, we don't need to bleed others. And so that's really fascinating. And again, this is not a sweeping statement saying that women don't kill other people or hurt children, or of course we know that happens. But historically speaking and symbolically speaking, and even, the records of history, it's really fascinating to think of the fact that men bleed themselves and each other and their loved ones as a sacrifice or as a connection to the divine. And we talk about rites of passage like we did at the beginning of this episode, where the Spartans are bleeding themselves for the goddess because they're incapable of bleeding otherwise, right? They're incapable of biologically bleeding in the way that women do. And so that just blows my mind sometimes when I think about it. And I think that is that the case? It explains a lot of what we've been seeing, especially in these 2,000 to 3,000 years of patriarchy, in which men bleed other men and men bleed the world, and themselves. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then the idea that I wanted to come back to is that then Jesus bleeds for Christians. And Christians drink that blood symbolically, of course, but they drink that wine blood to connect to him. Yeah. It's just so mind-boggling how symbolism, particularly around blood and bleeding, is so interconnected. We take it for granted, right? We take so much of that for granted, and yet it is so powerful symbolically. Yeah. And so I thought I would touch upon that. I didn't want to go into a whole thing about it because I did spend a lot of time on it in the Holy Grail episode. But I did want to talk about this connection again of sacrificing children, of bleeding for gods. And in this case, in the case of Jesus, bleeding for the salvation of Christians. Fascinating stuff. And so I thought I would leave you with modern day blood bending. Yeah. So at the top of the episode, we talk about how Artemis is the first blood bender, or at least I'm coining that. Artemis is the first blood bender. But I wanted to talk to you about this new episode of Gen V. I did my one of my lectures on the rituals for Artemis at the university, and it was kind of like a little TED talk at the university. And I was talking about rituals, and some of it had some blood involved, and some of it other things. And somebody came to me after the talk and said, "Have you watched Gen V?" And I said, "No, I was watching The Boys for a while, and then it became too toxically masculine and too much bleeding." Ironically, way too much bleeding. And I was like, no, it's too many dudes doing too many things. And I know it's not only male characters, obviously. So I think I got to like maybe the end of season 2, and I was like, no, thanks. And he said, well, there's this spin-off, Gen V. And he said, you'd be really fascinating with the character, with one of the characters in episode 1, because what she does is she is able to, and her name is Marie Morel, she is able to, at 12 years old, when she gets her period, she's, what's the word I'm looking for? She sees her menstrual blood floating, and she's terrified, of course. And then she weaponizes that menstrual blood, and she tragically kills her parents. And then she realizes that it's actually not just the menstrual blood, but that she is a blood bender. And so that she can weaponize her blood, or weaponize blood, so this becomes her superpower. And I thought, really? Wow. And he had said to me, the person who came up to talk to me had said, what's really fascinating is that, of course, this starts with her menstruation. And so I watched the first episode, and I thought, oh my God, she is a blood bender, and she is using menstrual blood as a weapon, in this case, to kill her family. So there's just so much symbolism there about disconnecting, about moving away from her childhood, moving into adulthood, moving into independence, slicing off her connection to her family. Like there's just so much symbolism there. And then she becomes a bloodbender. Now, bloodbenders come out of this the show, the last Avatar, or sorry, the last Airbender. Oh my God, Avatar, the last Airbender. And it's a technique. Bloodbending is a technique. If you watch the TV show, you can see it. I love the sequel series, The Legend of Korra, but of course I love the Avatar, the Last Bender series too. And it comes out of this idea that water benders can manipulate blood as well, because blood is a liquid. And so the story says that originally blood bending could only be done during the full moon. So the full moon is the time of menstruation for women. And so it's kind of interesting that water benders learned or could use blood bending during the full moon, and they could perform, this blood bending eventually without the full moon, once they were able to hone these skills. The most fascinating part about blood bending in the story of Avatar, is that it was created by a female waterbender named Hama. So she was in prison, and she was imprisoned, and during her time in her cell, she realized that wherever there is life, there is water. And every full moon, she started water bending the rats that were scurried in her cages, or that scurried around. And so she was water bending the liquids in their bodies, and of course one of that is blood. And then she realized, oh my God, blood, and hence blood in the prison guards, and she's able to free herself, and then able to hone this skill and then teach it to others, and so on. But what a fantastic superpower, started by women. In the Avatar, men also begin to use the skill, and then it becomes illegal later on, and there's like lots of politics around blood bending. But what an incredible superpower. And when I saw it in Gen V, I saw more than just the Avatar story. Because it starts with menstruation, I think that there's a great deal of symbolism there about the power of menstrual blood, the power of awakening young women to their power, which menstrual blood does. So all of the aspects that we talked about at the beginning of this episode, the use of menstrual blood has now made it into superhero culture. And we now have Marie, who is a blood bender, who can use her own blood. I mean, clearly now she uses all, her vein blood and all her other blood. And she's honing her skills. And she can use, and eventually I think she'll be able to use the blood of others, like the blood benders of the Avatar series. But what a fantastic 360, from the ancient, let's say Neolithic, pre-Neolithic, and whenever, right? Whenever we don't have records for, and the Greek and the Roman and the Egyptians and all of these cultures. And I'm sure there are other cultures in other parts of the world that are not, maybe in my area of expertise. And maybe there are scholars out there in that area of expertise that would love to share some of those stories. That talk about that, so that power of menstrual blood and of sacrificial blood and just of blood itself. And we've come all the way, to 2023, 2024, where we have a superhero, a female superhero, a woman superhero who weaponizes blood literally as a superpower. It's just fascinating. Fascinating symbolism. I think I could probably talk for hours about it, hours and hours and hours. And I think that we could really lose ourselves down a rabbit hole of blood meaning, of blood control, of blood use, of contagion too, of destruction and of healing, of all of these things that blood plays such a key role in. And so I don't think this is the last time. I don't think this is the last time that we're going to talk about blood. But I did want to take you through some of these fantastic stories and hopefully weave a thread of connection through them all. And hopefully that made some sense. So I want to thank you very much for joining me today and for spending some time with me and for listening to this. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it, please rate it, please like it, please comment on it. It helps the algorithm. Share it with others. And please also feel free to comment and send me messages if you have any sort of, well, all of your thoughts, but any suggestions, or have heard of stories that connect to this, any stories or books or anything that you think that come to mind as you were listening to this. I can't cover everything. And one of the things that I want to do, and I wanted to clarify as well, is that I'm a big fan of representation, obviously as an academic and a scholar. So sometimes people ask me to cover different parts of the world and different cultural mythology. And I know that we kind of have this idea that an academic or a scholar can cover anything. And I do feel like I could read a book about something and then cover it because I like teaching. But I really would love to focus on my area of expertise, which is, Greco-Roman, Anatolia, and now from my own background, from my own countries, the Balkans and Eastern European, which is where I'm kind of going to look into as well, because my background is a mix of Eastern European and Mediterranean. So my goal actually as an academic and on my personal level is that I focus on my own history and the history to which I can trace back my genealogy, let's say. And so then I feel like I'm representing that story. But when it comes to mythology, let's say from the African continent or from the Asian continent or from anywhere else, I feel like those gods, goddesses, mythologies belong to an academic or an expert or several or many from that culture or indigenous culture, for example. People ask me, well, let's talk about indigenous mythologies. And while I love reading about them and love learning about them, I don't represent them, and I don't want to take up that space. Yeah. And so sometimes I do have people asking me about that, but I just want to make it clear that it's a intentional choice. Yeah, it's an intention and it was an intention when I started my PhD, and it remains an intention, because when I started my PhD, I was like, I want to be able to teach about this, and I want to be able to stand in front of a class and represent as a descendant of the areas that I'm teaching. Maybe not 100% a descendant, but a descendant nonetheless, right? Because we're all kind of descendants of the global world, right? So that's like a difficult thing, but it's very important to me that we listen to scholars, especially in a world in which you have so much cultural appropriation, so much cultural experimentation. And I don't want to judge cultural experimentation. People kind of learning about different things, but appropriation is not something that I am for, and representation is something I'm really, really big fan of. And so, if there are scholars out there, or you can think of scholars out there that would love to collaborate or would want to collaborate on, let's say, stories about, I don't know, monsters or bleeding or sacrifice or mythology, where we can sort of contrast and compare together, that would be a really wonderful idea. So I'm always open to scholars to share, and I talk about what I'm working on or what I'm researching, and they talk about their own research. I think that would be fantastic, actually, a global collaboration. But I like to stick to this geographical space. And that's more for reasons of representation. And there's a lot in this geographical space. And even though I think it feels like we've talked about mythology forever, it is my argument that we've only heard sort of European Christian male version of a lot of the mythology that we're talking about. So there is a lot of room to go back and reread. As you know, there have been retranslations of the Odyssey, retranslations of the Iliad by modern feminist scholars that now bring other things to light. So there's lots to discover and to talk about. And for me, myself, on a personal level, I am really, really, really looking for my ancestral people's practices, particularly women's practices. And there's just so much to dig through. So much to dig through, my friends. So I just wanted to kind of say that, because sometimes I do get those questions, and I don't want to make a whole comment that's like this long. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you soon again for another episode in the next couple of weeks. Have a fantastic day.